How's it going, everybody? Welcome to the first episode of Shahs and Kings. I am your co-host, Shaheen Samadi, and here we have fellow co-host Keith D'Alessio and Weapon X. We're very excited to do this. We've been basically trying to do this podcast for many years now, but kind of came up with excuses, and we find, as this pandemic happened, we decided to just cut the bullshit and do it. Basically, the themes of the show include a lot of political topics, cultural issues happening in America and all over the world, and we're really excited to do this. And I'll just start with a brief introduction of myself, and then I'm gonna give the mic to the other co-host. My name is Shaheen Samadi. I'm a 26-year-old Iranian American hip hop artist, and basically, I come from a very Iranian background, and what I have to offer to the podcast is just my experiences as an Iranian growing up here. And I'm really excited to do this. I'm pretty sure I've said that like 3 times now. And now I'm going to let my friend Keith take over.
All right. What's up, everybody? My name's Keith D'Alessio. I am, as of today, 28 years old. So I'm the old man over here.
Happy birthday,
Um,
brother.
Thank you.
Happy birthday.
We're going to go drinking later. It's going to be good. So, how would I describe myself? I'm currently a supply chain engineer. It's a great job. Uh, been studying history my whole life. My background is not Iranian, if you couldn't tell. Um, I am white and black, a little bit Hispanic, mostly white, if you couldn't tell also. And yeah, what I have to offer is, well, you'll find out. So there you go.
Oh,
And
yeah.
now I'd
Fuck
like
yeah.
to introduce to you Weapon X, ladies and gentlemen.
um, I'm Weapon X. Unlike my co-host, I live in Los Angeles, California, and as everybody knows, there's a big Iranian American community here. I'm an Iranian American MC slash writer, and on occasion now podcast host. And I think what I bring to the table here is my unabashed opinion, whether it's popular or not. I won't hold back on anything that I actually feel with respect to, obviously, the confines of the show, of course. And I'm looking forward to getting started with this podcast and connecting with my host on various topics and connecting with you all and your feedback after these podcasts on social media. So hit me, I hit back.
All right.
Hey.
Fuck yeah. So today we wanted to talk about cultural identities, right? So as for example, as you've heard, we have two Iranian Americans on the show, and then we have Keith, who comes from many different cultures. And we want to basically talk about how this affected our life growing up, how it affected the way we view ourselves in this world, like how we see ourselves in relation to everything else going on in this world, how it affected our lives, some of the beautiful things that came with it, and some of the not so beautiful things that came with it, and how the rest of the country might kind of identify themselves as. So, with myself, my parents immigrated from Iran in the late 80s. And then a few years later, they had me. And basically, I grew up in this country I would say, in the post 9/11 era. So basically, I've been called a terrorist almost my whole life. San N word, camel rider, camel jockey, all these kind of weird things. And I kind of understand what it's like to be seen as the other, but it never really stopped me from identifying as an Iranian American. And it was always like this weird experience for me because I would go home and be surrounded by Iranian culture. Like I would listen to my mom listen to Iranian music. My parents would be watching Iranian TV. They would be speaking to me in Farsi, and I would be eating Iranian food. So like most of my life outside of school was just, Iranian culture. And then I'd go on the weekends, like I'd be hanging out with other Iranian kids, like because like basically the people that I hung out with were basically the children of my parents' Iranian friends, and like that's who I spent all my time with, right? Like we'd be going to, what we call mehmunis, which basically means like basically like a get together or a party, and but it was just weird because then I'd go back to school and it was just a completely different culture, and I think like for me it was like a little harder it was a little hard for me to bring that balance, like it was harder. I think it was one of the reasons why it was harder for me to make friends, because people had their own way of doing things and I had my own way of doing things, but not most people in school, I feel like they weren't first generation children, like most of them had, like maybe their great grandparents immigrated to America. And I don't even know if they identify themselves as like Italian Americans, Irish Americans, or if they just flat out call themselves Americans, which I think is, to me, that's strange. You know what I mean? Like, but I know, Keith, like, even though you're not first generation, you don't call yourself American. Like you call yourself, I mean, depending on the time of day, you might call yourself a Portuguese American, Italian American, Irish American, depending on, the context of the conversation. But Yanni, like, do you want to talk about your experiences with that?
Yeah, so that's yeah, my explanation is going to be a little longer, boys and girls, because
Yeah.
I got a ridiculous number of ethnicities in me. So to start out, my grandmother was a black woman from Cape Verde. Her parents moved here, must have been early 1900s. So she was the first. She would have been the first generation of that side of the family in the United States. She married an Italian man, so my dad's half black, and my mom is almost entirely Northern European. So feast your eyes. Um, the
So your father's mother is is black, basically.
Yes, yep.
Okay. Hmm.
And growing up with that experience was it was interesting because obviously my grandmother did not look like other Portuguese people.
Mm.
She would claim she was Portuguese, and there's probably a little Spanish in there too, so I'll just throw that in because Portugal's right next to it. But she would always claim to be Portuguese. And when I was younger, I didn't know any Portuguese people, so I was like, okay, maybe Portuguese people look like this. That's cool. And
Yeah.
then as I got older, started meeting Portuguese people, I had questions um, because my grandmother did not look anything like them. And that's when I found out we're not actually Portuguese, we're Cape Verdean. But apparently that's a pretty common thing for Cape Verdean immigrants. A lot of them identify with Portugal as the home base because that's who colonized them and brought them from Africa to there.
Mm.
So yeah, and let's see, my great grandfather. So slavery ended in Cape Verde in 1869. So my great grandfather was the first generation of his family out of slavery, actually, before
Wow.
he moved here. Um, and so learning that was interesting, and it was kind of funny because growing up, Shaheen can attest to this, but I've always been a pretty athletic kid, and I was either accused of using steroids or secretly being part black while I was growing up. For some reason, those two things went together to kids in a town that's 92% white, and then I found out one of those halves was true. So it was pretty funny. As far as my mom's side, the first record of my family of that side being in the United States was 1610.
Mm.
Um, so it's a little different experience. That's like, many
So how was
generations.
it for you, kind of like, because again, like you have a little bit of like, black in you, but you also have like a lot of other like European nationalities in you.
Yeah.
And that to me, like, did that affect the way you kind of see yourself in relation to everyone else?
Yes. In one sense, growing up, I never fit in with like, there'd be kids in our town who would be like, I'm 100% this, I'm 100% that, or I'm like 50% this, 50% that. And I could never say what percentage of anything I was. I'm like
Mm.
8% of 12 different things, aside from the Cape Verdean, which is like 20%, but regardless. Um, like those kind of kids, I would try to befriend because technically we're like we should have similar experiences if we're from the same ethnicity, but I didn't really connect with them either because it was such a tiny amount of who I was. Um,
Mm.
you know what I mean? It's so like I had kind of shallow relationships growing up, like friend wise, just because like I didn't really connect with the people around me that much because I didn't really connect with myself. I felt disjointed.
Yeah. And we're gonna bring Weapon X into this momentarily, but um, see, like a lot of people, like it doesn't matter, right? Like for example, like growing up, like I mean, like me and Keith grew up in predominantly like a white town, like a white upper class town, and I don't think like I mean, like consciously, like these little kids aren't walking around being like, "Hey, are you Italian American like me? Okay, let's be friends," right? Like like I
Mm-hmm.
think what it is, it's like there. I mean, like, and that's the thing with like with European diaspora, is that European diaspora don't really like identify with their culture. I feel like as much as like Iranians do, or black culture, or Asian cultures, or just more Eastern
Mm-hmm.
cultures. Like you don't hear that many Irish people going like I'm Irish American. Usually they just say I'm American. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Or they just get blended into like I'm white, right?
Yeah.
Like yeah, like we don't really hear like
Mm-hmm.
we don't really hear like uh I mean, I don't know, like you might see like some Greek festivals here and there, right? Or like
Mm-hmm.
there might be like the Irish St. Patrick parade. But other than that, I'm saying like there I feel like European culture in America just almost just gets blended into whiteness.
Yep.
And I feel like that's why I feel like like most white people are boring as fuck because they kind of just like they throw away their culture and their heritage and just blend it into and they they quote unquote they whitewash themselves. Like I'm saying, like Italians have a lot of cool things they can be proud of, like the Spanish, the Portuguese, like each of these cultures individually, like that it's cool, right? But
Mm-hmm.
I wanna bring Weapon X into it. So, uh, by the way, Weapon X, his name is I don't know if I think he said it earlier. His real name is Farnoosh. But how has your cultural identity affected you growing up?
Well, I'll get into that really briefly and just well, not briefly, but I want to touch on something briefly before I get into that. I happen to know um, what Keith is talking about because one of my best friends growing up of like 30 years is from Cabo Verde. And
Shit.
their whole community, like out there, and there's a whole community out there in New Bedford, Massachusetts.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very big, and they're very proud of their culture there. But it's I when you were touching up on them being Portuguese mixed with black or Afrocentric culture, I totally understand that because there's a lot of Cape Verdeans that are just as light as you,
Mm-hmm.
and they could pass for white people, and then there's plenty of them that are just dark as can be. So
Mm-hmm.
that identity, I definitely understand what you were touching on there. I just didn't want to interrupt
Yeah.
what you were saying. But going to me now, um yeah, I'm originally born here in the States. I was brought up in Brooklyn in New York, actually in an Italian American community out in Brooklyn. And the Italian Americans out there are really proud of their heritage. But I will say this, because we're focusing on my introduction here, I guess. What that has to do with me is the fact that I wasn't born around a lot of Iranian Americans. Initially, early in my life, I was just like you, Shaheen. I didn't connect with so many people within my culture. And as a matter of fact, I was so disconnected that my first language is not Farsi. My parents were learning Farsi as they were growing up here, and I was a kid. So as they practiced English, I learned English. Yeah, sure, I knew a few words, but I really didn't speak or comprehend until I moved out to Los Angeles. And part of that was a desire to connect with my family and my culture. And a part of that was just simply because when you move to a community now where your people of your ethnic background and culture is so prevalent, you just don't want to feel left out of it. And I really did come in feeling like an outsider. I already look white, if you haven't noticed. I have very Caucasian features. And, that was one of the difficulties actually that I faced coming up when I moved here, was the fact that I actually got ridiculed in the beginning for not being connected with my culture. I almost didn't feel Iranian enough. Like people
Wow.
wouldn't accept me over here. It was like, well, you're not Iranian. It doesn't matter if both your parents are. You can't speak really well. You don't really connect with your culture. Who are you? And I
Right.
almost felt excluded, by
Wow.
not by everyone, but a lot of people. And I got ridiculed for an accent. But ironically enough, the more I grew up, the more I learned about my culture because of the desire to connect with it. And I'm proud to say that I represent this culture now probably more than most of the people in this, in the Los Angeles community do. And they've slowly grown to
So
embrace it. So
what when you're like when the Iranians in LA kind of picked on you a little bit, um, were they kind of saying like did that make you resentful towards your own culture, at least like temporarily, like, oh, like fuck Iranians, like I'm just gonna go hang out with like non-Iranian people? Like, did that ever make you want to just like leave your community for a certain amount of time?
well, I was kind of conflicted because on one hand, I felt like, I was a little disappointed, and I don't think it was necessarily my family's fault. But at the time, I'm, a younger, um, a youth, so to speak, and I'm thinking to myself, well, why didn't my parents put me onto a lot of this stuff? Obviously, they're very proud; they're doing it at home, but they didn't
Mm-hmm.
feel. I mean, you felt proud enough to the point where you made my government name Iranian instead of giving me a American name that blend in. So why not all the rest of this stuff? And then the
So you
other,
resented them for not exposing you to the culture enough?
I would say I resented. I would say that I was a little bit disappointed that I didn't learn more, that I wasn't put on
Mm-hmm.
to more.
Mm-hmm.
And as far as the other kids, like I get called all the time. I get called Sefid, which is basically,
White.
the Persian word for white boy. And um, and just combined with, it'd be one thing if I just had light skin, but combined with the fact that initially I didn't have a whole lot of knowledge, or I wasn't connected, like I couldn't dance here, right? I looked like a fool. And like there were a lot of things that other kids were brought up doing, like you said, in their second
Listen, man, when it
lives
comes
at
to
home.
dancing Iranian, bro, it's all confidence. It doesn't matter like how good or bad you are, man. As long as you're hearing, you're like moving your shoulders, like da, 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 like as long as you're confident about it, people will think it's like mad funny. They don't really care. Like, dude, 99% of Iranians can't actually hair like they want to, but like I don't know. I feel like it's just about having fun.
Well, it was just a number of things. I went through a lot of, I felt like identity cultural crisis.
Mm,
Um, I went through different phases thinking that being a certain way would get me accepted more, or doing certain things and learning certain things. That's what made you Iranian. But really what it came down to is, um, being Iranian is just, representing you and keeping your culture alive, just learning more about your culture and how it incorporates into your day-to-day life and what makes you you. I mean, nobody at the end of the day can tell you what it means to be, in my case, or in your case, Iranian American, or in anybody else's ethnicity. And, it's part of what makes our experience in this, our country unique.
mm-hmm. For sure, man, for sure. So, I mean, um, with my well, with me, it's like I feel like I didn't even have like a say in it. You know what I mean? It's like uh I I was just surrounded by it all the time. Even though I'm not like, Connecticut doesn't have like a huge Iranian community at all, especially compared to like DC or LA. But, it was just like, again, like I'd come home And it, from there, until I wake up the next morning and had to go to the school bus, it was just Iranian culture. Like I'd be up in my room and I'd hear my mom singing to Gugush, right? And like it was just, and then I'd eat like nuna paneer, which is like bread and cheese and with tea, like every single day, right? Like it was just, and I think like growing up, even like after I went to like even after high school, I mean, I made my friends. Like eventually, I was able to like adapt to a certain point, and like most of my friends in school were obviously, well, actually no, in school, like 100% of my friends were non-Iranian because I was the only Iranian kid in school. But like, but then I think there was like a point in college where like like the Black Lives Matter movement, started picking up steam in 2015. And one of my friends said, you know, you let your friends call you Shaheen, but your name is actually Shaheen, right? And why do you allow like white people to do that? And it made me think, what I mean? I'm like, well, that is a good point. Like, why do I let that happen? Not whether it's wrong or right. It started. Uh, it allowed me to start questioning things a little bit, and that's like when I started getting into like Malcolm X and how into his own culture Malcolm X was. And that's when and then like shortly after I went to Iran. I went to Iran like many times before as well. And but I went to Iran, and I went to Persepolis. I tried, I saw Shiraz and Isfahan, and that shit affected that shit was like an out of body experience. Like like I said, I've been to Iran many times, but when you go to like the sacred capital of like the empire like 2500 years ago, dude, like that's like I'm not a religious person at all, but dude, but that was like a very spiritual experience, man. It was like a chance to really connect with your heritage. And to this very day, like naturally, like when I see an Iranian, I just like connect with them more. And like I remember like a few months ago, around the time when the pandemic started, I I overheard like two people in a grocery store speaking Persian, and I got all excited and I wanted to go introduce myself to these people and be like, "Oh, what's up? Like I'm also Persian. What up? What up?" And but I didn't because I didn't want to like I was I guess like I didn't want to be weird, I guess. But I got really excited. I know it's different in LA because in LA it's like everyone's like everyone's Persian in LA. So like hearing someone speak Farsi in LA, it's like just another day in the life. But for me, like it gets lonely as an Iranian American. And I guess like I'm what they call a third culture kid. Like where you try to blend in like the Iranian and the American side, and that's what I do. I mean, like I rap in English. And like even though a majority of my audience is Iranian, even though a majority of my fan base is Iranian, uh like I'm ultimately like I make American music at the end of the day, right? So I try to like blend the two. But Keith, do you have anything to say? How about, let me ask you this, Keith? Like I know you, like you're multiple cultures and stuff, right?
Yeah.
But I know you identify more with certain cultures than others. Like like I see you have Thor's hammer in the background.
Yes.
And and when I hang out with you, uh you're wearing the Thor's hammer chain. So talk about that. Like talk about what that means to you.
So, and part of this might sound bad to some of the listeners, but that's all right. Growing up, because like I said earlier, I would try to identify with people who were also the same ethnicities as me to a certain extent, right? So, because I didn't look a certain way, like let's say I went to hang out with Portuguese kids, I don't look Portuguese, you know, or Italian because I don't have dark hair, dark eyes. I didn't have a tan when I was younger because I never went outside. Um, so there were certain ethnic groups where like even if I tried hanging out with them, it was kind of like I didn't belong there. So I stopped identifying with them as much, and I started identifying more with the ones that never acted like I shouldn't be there. I'll put it that way.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so like the Irish, the Scottish, the Norwegian, like, um, the Cape Verdean, honestly, like in Connecticut, I know Massachusetts has a pretty big population, but Connecticut does not. Um, I was the only Cape Verdean in our town, I think, like that I knew of, growing up until, actually, I think that might still be the case. I don't know. But, so I never really got a chance to experience that culture. I was actually planning on taking a solo trip to Cape Verde this year before all the COVID stuff, to the island my great grandfather's from. Unfortunately, that's probably gonna have to wait a little while, but still plan on doing that. And um, yeah, there's just it basically became like whatever cultures I was most accepted by growing up that I was a part of, I would try
Right.
to identify more with, kind of. Not that I like pushed away the Portuguese or the Italian or the Spanish or what have you, but I just consciously or unconsciously like kind of shied away from it a little bit.
Mm. Wow. That is pretty crazy though. But I think what makes you like with like your particular case interesting and like a little bit different than I would say like other American kids is that I feel like for example, I remember I was friends with this kid in high school, and grew up to be a pretty racist individual. And when I'd
Mm-hmm.
ask, and he'd make fun of me for like being Iranian, right? But
Yep.
then I'd ask him like where he's from, and then I guess he'd be like, oh, like my great 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 grandparents were like from Norway and Sweden and France, maybe, or I don't know, like maybe Scottish or British somehow, and you know, uh, but he identifies as like American American,
Yep.
and to me, like that just doesn't make any sense, like because to me, the like American doesn't mean anything unless you're indigenous. Like to me, it's
Mm-hmm.
like you're either like you're Iranian American, you're Black Americans, Portuguese Americans, Italian, Irish, whatever, Chinese Americans, uh, Iraqi Americans, Afghan, list goes on and on. But to me, like
Mm-hmm.
America, to me, has always been the culture of every culture, you know. So it's
Yep.
like there's like I said, unless you're like a native Indian, you're to me it's like there's no such thing as an American, right?
Yeah.
but
That's yeah.
but like would you say that like kids, not or not even just kids, but people who in general who aren't first generation, like let's say their parents immigrated here like more than 100 years ago, like do you think like I mean like it's just crazy, man, like I can't even imagine what their lives are like to be like, I mean, they're culturalists in a way. You know what I mean? Like they
Mm-hmm.
didn't grow up with like, because if they were like Italian immigrants who immigrated here like 100 or 120 years ago, like they're not really raised in Italian culture. They don't speak Italian at home. They don't speak like they don't celebrate specific Italian holidays. It's like the way me and Farnoosh celebrate Nowruz. You know,
Yeah.
so like I just can't imagine what that's like to just have no culture. You know what I mean? And that might sound offensive to like a lot of white folks, and I hope I don't get canceled by like white Americans. But like, I mean, like, I don't know, like, and that's probably like why I plan on like marrying Iranian at the end of the day, because
Mm-hmm.
like I want to preserve that, and like it's not, like embrace that, like Iranian Americans building other Iranian Americans and Portuguese Americans uh, building other Portuguese Americans and so on and so forth. But I guess the question, for a lot of people like you is like, eventually you're like, I feel like you identify as more like, with you, I know you identify more with like your Vikings and your like your Thor's, your Norse mythology side more than
Yeah.
like your other cultures.
Yeah.
Even though your last name is D'Alessio, which I believe is Italian, right?
Yes.
So yeah, yeah. So yeah,
Yeah.
cool stuff, man. Cool stuff.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's kind of, it goes back to, some people say like white people have no culture. And In a way, it makes sense because if you come to this land,
And that's said by a white guy, ladies and gentlemen.
if you come to this country, right, from wherever you're from in Europe, and you decide to just give away whatever culture you came from, what is here?
Yeah. What is American culture? And it's also like specific, like it's also important to realize that every immigrant, it's not that they're trying to escape their culture. They're trying to escape oppression. And they're trying to escape like governments that are actually oppressing their own culture. Like let's look at
Mhm.
Iranians, for example, right? With the Islamic regime. It's like they're attacking Iranians the most at the end of the day. Like the Iranian government, like the Islamic Republic of Iran they're anti-Iranian. You know what I mean? Like when they came to power, like they tried to get rid of Nowruz. They tried to knock down Persepolis and the Tomb of Cyrus, and like they when they teach in their school system, like their programs in school, they don't really teach like pre-Islamic history. They just teach, about they meant like when they teach history, they mainly teach about Islamic history, and they teach Arabic. Well, I mean, they teach Farsi obviously, but they also want their kids to learn like Arabic as well, right? And like they're very, like they oppress Iranians against their own culture, and that's why like many Iranians who leave Iran, they come to America so they can be Iranians freely, not so they can be Americans, because that doesn't, like, to say if I'm trying to be American, that doesn't make any sense. Like, what do you mean you're trying to be American? That like you sound dumb when you say that, in my opinion. It's like, um, you know what I mean? So
Mhm.
I'm sure like Farnoosh had like a similar experience too. Like, what the hell does it mean to be American? Like to me, like if you like a woman walking around in a burqa in America is just as American as like some dude like grilling burgers in his yard.
Mhm.
Because to me, like being American is just about like being who you want to be. Ultimately, that's what it is. Being who you want to be,
Yeah.
Well,
right?
I can offer a, a I wouldn't say a different perspective, but an alternative perspective to the conversation. Um, the one thing I'll say is this: yeah, I do believe that a lot of generations of different cultures that come here don't necessarily retain their own the culture of their own background. I mean, a part of what happens here in the American experience is, yeah, we're encouraged to get along together, accept each other, and in essence, a lot of ways, it brings us to assimilate. Um, as far as being Iranian American, I definitely connect with my culture, and I definitely appreciate all our traditions and partake in them. Very proud of having a heritage, but on where the alternative perspective comes in is the fact that um as much as we'd like to, like say, okay, a lot of different cultures that have come here from different European countries and so forth have assimilated and so forth, they may have gotten rid of their culture. I believe that, like, for example, if somebody from let's say an Italian American came here, they may not necessarily have kept their Italian side, so to speak. Maybe they don't celebrate every holiday. Maybe they're not connected with, their traditions and so forth. But where the American comes in, and even us as Iranian Americans, or Keith, as a mixture of cultures with the American culture, so forth. I don't want to pin down one,
Yeah.
but um, I think being American, in terms of where the American part comes in, has to do with ideals and values. Because for one, the the culture that a lot of people give up when they migrate here is not American to begin with. It could be Italian, it could be French, it could be Chinese. They're abandoning that essence of their culture, or maybe leaving that behind, or losing aspects of it. But where when people say they're American, and where it includes us, is I believe that it has to do more with the ideals of what this country was founded upon. In a lot of ways, even though I'm Iranian American, there's a lot of parts of me that are very American. You know, the pursuit of happiness, what this country was founded on, and freedom of speech. These things, even as Iranians
Well,
migrating to
yeah,
the States these are
yeah.
things that we embrace as part of being American, because within our own culture at home, currently, we're not allowed to do these things.
But
We,
but but the but where I want to break with you on that, like when you say freedom of speech, that's not a uniquely American cultural thing, right? Like, for example, there was a time when in Iran where we had, the Iranians had more freedom of speech. Not, I mean, I'm not saying that during the Shah's time that you had the most freedom of speech, but like, um, people were, for the most part, were able to be themselves, right? And then then shit, went south,
Eh,
with the
well, it
revolution.
depends on what ethnic culture you're referring to within Iran as well. And like I said, don't disagree on many levels. But say, for example, um, there were many minority cultures within Iran that didn't feel like they had freedom under the Shah. And even before that, there were many different minority cultures that felt like they didn't have freedom under the Qajar dynasty or so forth. So
Right.
it's not a unique principle to America. For example, like I always refer back to the Cyrus cylinder,
Yeah.
um, in terms of a lot of the principles that are adopted in countries today. But like, and I'm not saying that's the only part of being American, but a part of when we say American, these are things that we've adapted to the American way of life. They're a part of, regardless of what your culture is when you migrate here. And I'm not downplaying the Iranian side at all, but what I'm saying is that's why we are Iranian American, because we do maintain that heritage, we do maintain those cultural values, but
Mhm.
we also embrace like the foundations of many of the original principles that the Constitution of this country was founded upon. And I'm not saying that,
Yeah.
they were totally right in that aspect. We did screw the Native Americans in terms of like those original Americans came in. They did screw the Native Americans, not downplaying that at all. But I'm talking about in terms of how they left their country, mainly like England or France, to escape
Mhm.
persecution of that sort and develop their own beliefs and ideals in a constitution and a bill of rights. That's the part of American that we integrate into our
Mhm.
day-to-day lives, combining that with our cultural aspects and traditions from Iran, such as celebrating things like Eid, Mehragan, Shaba Yalda, or
Mhm.
simple things like
Mhm.
having a Mahmoudi family united. And I think it's a beautiful thing to be able to take the best of both things that we've learned from both backgrounds and create that into the unique experience that we have living as Iranian Americans, or anybody that's attached different culture American for that matter.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Wow. Um, and that's actually like an excellent way to put it. But I guess like where the confusion comes on is like, and then like what I just said to Keith a few minutes ago is like I cannot imagine like just being like raised without like that culture, still like a cultural background that to rely on. Like, yes,
Mhm.
we're all American, but that's just supplemental to like who we really are.
Right. And what I referred to when I was discussing that is, yeah, that was probably the American side, but you're looking at what you're getting more at is the side that they've essentially, in more words or less, left behind. Like if you're an Italian American, it would, and I know still a lot of Italian Americans that are very proud of their culture, but there are many as well, for example, that don't celebrate any of their traditions, and they're totally like, they fall into that category of no culture and bland. And I think that part, regardless of what culture, is kind of a shame, where you don't acknowledge the traditions of the area or the
Very
region that
boring
you came from
individuals, man.
before, and and you lose that over time in generations, or even sometimes I've met first generations ourselves,
Mhm.
Iranian American. Like that's why I made an effort to learn the language and to learn about our culture, because there were people like me that didn't do what I did. They totally just completely obliterated that. They don't speak Farsi. There's nothing no other than maybe some, if they look at some facial and distinguished features that could distinguish
Yeah.
them from being anything other than American.
And
And I
usually
think
those are the
that's a
types of,
shame.
yeah. And usually it's those are the types of people, like those Iranians that you talk about, that tend to be more on the politically conservative side, and um like they completely allow themselves to be whitewashed. And I mean, unfortunately, that, you know, they go out and vote for Trump and do lots of ignorant things like that. And um you know, and yeah. And but that's a whole different, like, we can talk about that in like a whole different episode. Basically,
And we
like
probably will.
the quote unquote Uncle Toms of every community that exists, the self-hating, like, I mean, there's definitely like the Iranians, right? Like I have no authority to talk about like other culture Uncle Toms, right? Like when I talk, you know, when you talk about like the traditional use of that term, right? Like when we're talking about like the black Uncle Tom, right? Like I have no authority to talk about that. I'm not going to call anyone a, you know, an Uncle Tom when it comes to black people. That's for their specific community to discuss. But I have a whole, I have a lot to say when it comes to our community, and you know, like the Iranians who support Trump. And yeah, but I think honestly, I think we'll leave it at that for this episode. I think we only have like 40 minutes because of how much time Zoom allows us. We're
Mhm.
pretty new at this. I know we're novices, but again, I just want to thank Keith and Farnoosh, aka Weapon X, for doing this. And we're gonna be doing a lot more of this every Wednesday. And thank you for tuning in, guys.
Well, I think we should do one more thing before we leave.
What?
Let's go ahead and before we have, well, because I don't know if we have developed the official social media page for it yet, but until then, maybe we should just go ahead and, especially in Keith's case, who isn't as out there as we are in terms of entertainment, maybe drop the social media link on there so they can touch back at us if they'd like.
Yeah, so I mean, at the time of this recording, that hasn't been created yet. By the time you listen to this, it will have been created, and I'm pretty sure the handle of the Instagram is going to be at Shahs and King, at Shahs and Kings, excuse me. Um, and yeah, we'll figure out how to get that to you guys after we end the recording, but it won't be hard to find. I promise that. And yeah. All right.
Okay, I guess
All
So,
that's
right,
it.
guys.
all right. Well, until next time, have a good one, and we'll see you next week.